Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 629. Releasing September 5 in Australian cinemas is A Horse Named Winx, a documentary that tells the story of Winx, the world's greatest racehorse, who captivated racing pundits worldwide during her epic 33 race winning streak. A captivating exploration into the triumphs and struggles of managing the success and livelihood of a once-in-a-generation thoroughbred. A Horse Named Winx is also based on a biography by journalist and author Andrew Rule, who also writes and narrates the film. And I'm happy to say that Andrew joining me now on the podcast. Andrew, how are you?
It's great to be with you, Matthew, and I'm pleased that you've taken the time to take an interest in our little film.
Well, it's a little film, but it's about a big story.
It is.
And it's a story that really captivated Australia, but also, like, as I said before, worldwide, the horse racing industry as a sport, and I know the word industry, some people frown upon it, but it is very much an industry as well, worldwide. This story of Winx, the long-legged kind of like filly that
Yeah.
turned into this great racehorse, or perhaps
Yeah.
the greatest racehorse of all time, is something else altogether. You wrote the biography back in 2018,
Yeah.
and now you have this film. How soon did you know that a film was in the workings with this book? Did you know it was going to happen sooner, later? How does it all come about for you?
No, it's just I got a call. I'm going to say 3 years ago. It might have been a bit less, 2.5 years ago, from someone I didn't know, and the someone I didn't know was Janine Hosking, who's a documentary filmmaker based in Sydney. She's actually a Victorian by birth, just because she's from Swan Hill on the border. But she rang me out of the blue and said, "Oh, I'm Janine Hosking and I make films." And she was very polite and gentle and calm, and asked me about the rights to the book, and said she was interested in making a documentary film. And I said, "Well, you could get the rights to the book, I guess, but it seems to me that if you're on limited budget and everything else, you'd be better off to have me on board than just the book, because the book will give you, a lot of knowledge and a lot of facts and a lot of phrases and things. But in the end, I know not only what's in the book, I know what's not in the book.
Hmm.
I know all the other stuff, and I know how to find the people and the right talent. And, I could steer you towards the people that I think would be good on camera, and those steer you away from those who probably aren't. And I know the phone numbers and addresses and all the rest of it. So I was able to sketch in a mud map for her, and she said, within days or whatever, she said, "Yeah, I think that's the way to do it." So she engaged me to assist her. I have to say, Janine Hosking is a filmmaker and a very good one. And I am a journalist, a print journalist, who has dabbled on the edges of film and documentary and so forth. So it's in no way my film, it's her film, but I helped her make it.
Janine has done many documentaries before. Knowing the
Yep.
Score came out a couple of years ago. I'm Not Dead Yet about Chad Morgan as well.
Yep.
Um, when she approaches you and talks to you about the rights and you guys come to agreement on the movie, did the role of you being narrator, was that something that was considered early on? Did that come later?
I think it came later. I was surprised. But I have to say, she made this with a very tiny film crew. She had a partner, Stephen, does the sound, and Kevin, the cinematographer, camera guy, he did the shooting, most of it. And sometimes I'd be with them. But, it's a very tightly run, streamlined operation. And therefore it made sense that if I was around, if I was the alleged expert, to use me. I'm not particularly good at it. I don't, and I said to her, "I'm an old baggy ass journo. I'm not going to look good on screen. You need the real people, the real talent on the screen as much as possible." And I mean, I think she took that on board and used me sparingly to fill the gaps, in the narrative story where you need to link things or explain who someone is. I was able to do that with reasonably deftly, because I'm a writer and I can tell a story. I'm pretty rough and ready, but I can tell a story because I do a lot of podcasting like yourself. So I was sort of competent enough to stitch together different bits of the story for her. and a lot of that stuff I was able to adapt. Things I'd written in the book, just little pens, sort of pen portraits of people and that sort of stuff. I was able to adapt it from the book.
We're making the film, it comes down to, a team. You need a team around a director or a producer or a
Yeah,
writer, which Janine has put together. The first step of that was having you come on board. And the same thing in regards to, raising a racehorse.
yeah,
When it comes to Winx, you have Chris Waller, who
yeah,
is front and center here of the story.
yeah,
And from all indications in the movie, he could be a very guarded man, a very thoughtful
yeah.
man, but also clearly a very emotionally intense man as well.
He is.
He holds everything like really to his heart, especially when it comes to his horses. The whole thing about seeing him every morning go to each stable and check
Yeah,
on every horse and all that. To
yeah,
me, it's really refreshing to find, because sometimes you hear stories about different trainers and different things, are real kind of
yeah.
horror stories. But on the other end, you got who is in this movie. Was it easy for him though to kind of open up and get on screen to talk about this stuff? Because it's one thing where you talk with him, and you can have his words printed in a book, but having him on screen and expose
True.
himself that way,
I,
I'm just really interested in that.
I was. I wasn't shocked, but I was pleasantly surprised with the access Janine got to Chris, because he literally is as busy as the Prime Minister. I mean, that might sound outrageous. He starts work at around 2:30 in the morning. He gets up to go in, and he's there when his staff are knocking off at 6 o'clock that night. Now, this is a man that's, really, these are enormous days. And one day a week he stays home with his family. And I think that Sunday is the day that he did the filming with Janine. But he, apart from being very busy and very careful with his time and very efficient, he is also all the things you said. He's a guy with a high emotional intelligence. He does love his family and his horses and all that, and it comes through. He's a guy who's easily moved to tears through the emotions of the business. And I was, as I say, I wasn't shocked, but I was sort of surprised at how good he was on camera and how he holds your attention. Of course, Janine shot a lot of time with him. She shot hours with him and with his wife, Stephanie, and with a lot of other people. And she was able to distill it to the very best bits, of course. But he was great, and Stephanie, his wife, was great, and Hugh Bowman, the jockey, I thought was great. I've seen some people suggest that he's, a bit stoic and a bit wooden or something, but I like that about him. He's the counterpoint to Chris. He is very calm and very unemotional, and he doesn't talk in cliches. He speaks very clearly and not in cliches, which most professional sports people do speak in cliches, because they just become like riding school ponies. They just do the same thing every time there's a camera there. He doesn't.
When it comes to the team that is with Chris, and they're taking care of Winx, and they're there to train her and take care of her and groom her, you got this interesting cast of characters that
Yep.
we kind of introduce, people from all over the world, and their one purpose is
Yeah.
to make sure that Winx is healthy and succeeds. When we are introduced to all these characters, it almost kind of feels like I'm kind of watching in a certain way. And it might sound like a weird comparison, like a Guy Ritchie movie where you got all these different people with different
Yeah.
kind of
You do.
personalities and special kind of
Yeah.
like they got their speciality and they
Yeah.
got their own kind of little personality thing. And
Exactly.
as you as a writer, it's like you can't write them any better than they are in real life
No,
sometimes, can't you?
you can't. I mean, the beauty of this is all we had to do was capture an element of reality, and we had a good story. I made this point the other day when I wrote a piece about this for my paper, the Herald Sun in Melbourne, and I'm saying that racing and boxing throw up great stories,
Hmm.
because they're risky sports. They're very risky, and they require courage as well as everything else. And they have always produced great literature for that reason. But it's very hard for filmmakers to make a film about boxing or racing that hold a candle to the real thing. The real thing
Hmm.
is too good for a filmmaker to be able to make to capture on film with actors and stunt people and all that. anything that's as good as the real thing. And there's notable exceptions. I know you're thinking now, well, what about Robert De Niro in Raging Bull? And you'd be right. And what about Christian Bale in that other boxing movie?
The
True,
Fighter. Yep.
but there's the Fighter. There's so many bad ones. And racing, horse stuff is notoriously bad, I think, nearly always, without naming names. And, I grew up with National Velvet and all that stuff. It can be moving. But these days, the great advantage now, as you know better than I do, is that when you want to do something on Amy Winehouse or Ayrton Senna or Winx, you've got all this high definition footage that's been shot, or pretty good definition footage that's been shot, that's out there. These are people and animals that have been filmed for dozens or hundreds of hours, and a filmmaker has a lot of stuff to choose from, and they can build a really moving film from reality, from actuality. You don't need actors. You don't need to reconstruct. You don't need stunts done. There it is. You have to build it from the building blocks that are available. And it seems to me that this Winx film is a great example of that. It's a very moving story, which you probably couldn't have captured, even with a $50 million budget, using actors and stunts and a fictitious script.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. I think to me, and what I always come back to, and no matter what type of movie it is, whether it's a documentary about a racehorse or the big budget space spectacle directed by George Lucas, to me it comes down to what are the stakes, what are the emotional stakes, what are the character stakes in the film. And when it comes to the story of Winx, where we see here in A Horse Named Winx, that stakes comes down to a couple of things. One of them, though, above everything else, is the stress of success. Because while we're also dealing with a racehorse and its team around it, we're also dealing with owners and stakeholders and millions of dollars on the line at any type of prospective race, and what can happen if a race goes wrong and someone falls out of horse. There's all that kind of stuff there. And what really amazes me with documentaries like A Horse Named Winx is we know the conclusions to the story. We know, but when watching the races and hearing the stories, you can't help but kind of hold your breath and think, well, what if? Even though you know that what if can't go anywhere but one direction. Absolutely. I think it's amazing how films, especially documentary films, can do that.
Oh, it staggers me. I mean, we all know how World War II ended, but it doesn't stop us watching another World War II movie if it's good enough. And that's the reality. I'll watch old Muhammad Ali stuff, and I know what happened, but that doesn't matter. It's still exciting to watch it again. I've seen this film. I'm surprised that I've seen this now 4 times, the Winx film, and each time I'm totally engaged with it. Now I find that that's a tribute to Janine's craft. She's a skilled editor, and her choice of music and the way she moves through the story, it never lags. And even watching it the 4th time, I'm always engaged. Now, I think that tells you something about, the craft of making stuff. And it's the craft of writing, isn't it? You're trying to leave out the boring stuff. Like Elmore Leonard says, leave out the stuff that sounds like writing. And I think good filmmakers are the same. They're storytellers, and they grasp that. But what you said about stakes, I think that puts the finger on what makes a good film work. Is there has to be something at stake. And in racing, it's your neck. Sometimes it's your life and limb. It's dangerous, and also it's money. So it's high stakes in both senses.
I tend to ask sometimes a couple of silly questions. I like to put silly questions out there because I might perceive them as silly, but you might not. The first one I want to ask is, a lot of times throughout the movie, and I imagine being in the book as well, you describe Winx in certain terms: cool, aloof, comparisons to Greta Garbo, perhaps like a diva nature towards her as well. And I know this might be silly, but I'm a middle class suburban guy, so I'm not sure for myself. I don't hang around horses that much. But do horses have a personality in the same way that I might say a human has a personality?
Well, yeah. I mean, a horse is not overly gifted with brains, despite what people say about about them. I'm not convinced that a horse is as clever as, a sheepdog or probably even a pig, to be honest. I'm not sure you could teach a horse as many tricks as you could some other animals. But they do vary a lot from each other, even within that one breed, which is bred for speed and endurance. They haven't been bred like a sheepdog's been bred for brains. Horses have not been bred for brains. But they do. Winx is quite. She's not, a horse that rushes up and is affectionate and rubbing herself all over everybody. She's not a particularly charismatic animal in that sense. She is. She's a cool, calm athlete. She's almost the perfect athlete. Apart from one problem, which is highlighted or noted in the film, she had what Chris Waller calls a phobia, a slight phobia of the barriers, the starting barriers. She would play up them sometimes. Apart from that, did you notice how kindly she races on the bit? She doesn't pull. She doesn't push her mouth against the jockey. She just goes exactly where she's put in the race and responds to the jockey really perfectly. She does everything very efficiently. And in fact, Hugh Bowman said she can even swim like Dawn Fraser, whatever she does. Hugh Bowman calls her the businesswoman because she's so businesslike with what she does. And I think that's an insight into her. And, some other horses are quite different. Some are very curious, and they come up to you and they want to take the cap off your head, and they drop it on the floor, and then they pick it up and they play around like some dogs do and some dogs don't. They vary a bit.
My next silly question. I am always fascinated with the genesis of a racing horse name, because there's been some really great ones throughout the years. And here you have Winx, which comes from co-owner Richard Treewicki, who passed away back in 2021, but he does appear in the film in some circumstances. He talks about how Winx is inspired by, Las Vegas showgirls, and you get the wink and you're in, right? So Winx. I know you've been around horse racing for a long time, and you did some amateur races back in your time as well.
Yeah.
What is the best story you've heard behind a racing horse name outside of Winx? Is there one that really stands out for you in all the times that you had covering the industry?
I wish I'd had 10 minutes of warning. I've got to summon them up. There have been some very clever names over the journey. Yes, well, I'm trying to think up the ones that are sort of clean enough to talk about. But Winx itself, the Winx name it's a little bit out there, a little bit risque, and it's possibly a little more risque than the explanation he gave on screen. And you could see that the other owners looked at him slightly aghast, wondering what he was going to say. But I think the real explanation might be slightly more earthy than the one he gave. But yeah, horse names are a fascinating thing. In fact, I do occasionally name horses for other people. And in fact, I sent one in yesterday for a horse. Not that this is particularly wonderful. Names are hard to get because so many thousands of them have been used before. So the great name that you want, you don't get because it's banned for the next 20 years or whatever. One that we're naming a filly at the minute, she's by Lord of the Sky from a mare called Biscay Sport. So there's sport in the mother's side. And I put in the name skydiving and parachutist because I can't get skydiver and I can't get parachute. But I thought that the combination of those two names was good. The other one I thought of for her was Heavens to Betsy. Now they're not sort of shocking names or particularly overly witty, but they're better than a lot of the ones you see going around. But over the journey there have been some clever names. Light Fingers, Bart Cummings' first Melbourne Cup winner, was by Lee Falou, a French name, and Lee Falou means the thief or the pickpocket. And Light Fingers, of course, is what people say about thieves, that Matthew has light fingers, he goes shoplifting.
Right.
It's an expression. And she was beautifully named on her pedigree, but also she was a little light, thin, fine filly. And so it's been one of the most beautiful names in racing. Yeah, that stands out. It's not funny, but it's clever.
It's always fascinating to me. It's kind of like, I think sometimes if you start a new band, especially these days, every other band is all the
Yeah.
great band names are gone. You can't call yourself,
Oh no,
AC/DC, whatever. It's taken, it is such a fascinating thing.
it
I want to
is.
also ask you about, your main bread and butter that a lot of people like know you for, in regards to your writing and your podcast, and you're like steeped into like the crime, Australian crime. So
Yep.
when you dove into something like the story of Winx, is that for you a breath of fresh air to go out of that kind of like that more kind of murky kind of side of Australian underground kind of stuff and go into this really kind of like feel good story, which does have its own drama and
It
everything
does.
else and thrills, but different to the other stuff. When you go into the world of Winx, is that for you kind of like the light after being like in the murky depths for some time?
Oh yeah, it's much more pleasant in that respect. Look, a long time ago when I started in journalism, which is frighteningly, nearly 50 years ago, um, it soon became clear to me when I got to the Melbourne newspapers, to the big league, that that crime, and allied stories, but crime and sport were two subjects that interested a lot of people across the demographics. So you could walk into a courtroom and you'd be there and there'd be the judge, this is before the proceedings start. There's a judge and a QC and another barrister and a prosecutor and all the way down to the tip staff and the cleaning lady. And they'd all talk about the football and in the past they talk about the races. These were shared interests with a lot of people. And I realised that sport and crime appeal to a lot of people. And I wanted to write stories that appealed to a lot of people, that people were interested in. And I didn't know much about sport, and I still don't. All sports writers know more about sport than I do.
Mm.
But I realised early on when the Age newspaper put me on sport, when I was a young reporter, that it was a subject, although I didn't know much, people read it. And you had the license to thrill. Because sport doesn't matter, it's essentially a nonsense. It's an artificial construct. You can write anything you like about it, and you can make it as dark as you like or as funny as you like. It's a really great practice if you want to write well for an audience, because you don't have to stick to the strict facts. You can make it up, and you don't make up facts, but you can make up the way you write it. You can use
Yeah.
hyperbole, exaggeration, or whatever you want, and you can tell funny, happy stories or horror stories, depending. There's tragedies in sport, Crime, same thing. It's People are fascinated by life and death. People are fascinated by sex, life, death, and money.
Mm.
Reward, greed. These are the subjects that interest us all. And when you think about it, what's Shakespeare, the greatest writer of all? Most of his big plays that we still refer to, Macbeth and The Merchant of Venice, they're actually crime stories. They're not
Mm.
sports stories, but they are crime stories. And you think, oh yeah, Merchant of Venice, it's a gangster yarn.
Hmm.
When you think about it, it's a money lender who said, if you don't pay the money back, I'm going to take a knife and cut a pound of flesh out of you. Well, that's Tony Soprano, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd understand that because you see a lot of films.
Yeah.
Does it resonate with you, what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Because I think also when it comes down to movies as well, crime and sport as genres really stick out. Because again, coming back to what I was saying before, it comes down to the stakes, what's on the line. And a lot of times
Yeah,
when it comes to both those genres, especially, there's always something on the line. A lot of times it comes down to one man or one woman kind of standing up for something or being
yeah,
destroyed by something.
yeah.
And funny enough, you talked about Merchant of Venice and Tony Soprano. One of my favorite Shylocks I've seen in film was
Yeah,
played by Al Pacino.
yeah.
He did a show like back in, I think it was like 2013 or
Well,
something. So yeah,
exactly,
and he's like, Michael Corleone. So
exactly.
it fits all
Well,
together. Yeah.
the term Shylock that is used in mafia circles to this day is straight from Shakespeare. There's the
Yeah.
connection. I mean, it's wonderful. So I think we tap into universal emotions with variations on sport and variations on crime. Not all crime. I've written about a lot of crime, and I've published a lot of books and so on. I've got one out currently called Life and Crimes, would you believe, which is the same name as my podcast. But there are some stories I think that I don't like doing much on because I think they put people off, and crimes against children, stuff like that. Some things are so repellent that people don't want to read about them. And I prefer with crime, if it can be chilling, but it can also, with some stories, can be sort of humorous sometimes, in a black humor.
Well, yeah, I mean, something like Chopper, for example, shows a lot of that kind of black humor for sure. Because the character himself is such a character, right? So, yeah,
full of black humor. One of the funniest men that I've ever met. John Sylvester and I, did his early books. We sort of half ghosted them, but all the funny stuff in it was what he brought to the table. Mind you, he, like everyone else, he'd taken stories that he'd heard in jail and improved them and added to them and all that. But he was a great natural raconteur, a fine raconteur, funny man, and it came across. And all the funniest stuff in the Chopper books were his. We added a lot and we refined it and we fiddled with it and we added fish, we added sort of seafood extender to fatten it up. But in the end, the best of it was him. And that genre predates Tarantino. We were doing Chopper books before I'd ever heard of Tarantino. And it predates by a long way someone he inspired, and that is Scott Ryan, the guy that does Mr. In Between. Is that his name?
Oh, right. Yeah. I know what I'm talking about.
So he sort of cut his teeth reading the Chopper books and watching the Chopper film. And that taught him, this works. I'm going to do stuff like that. And he's done a wonderful job of it to distill that essence of black humor and move it across into a suburban hitman. But it's Chopper-esque. It really is derived from Chopper. And Chopper sort of pulled it all together in his own strange way, from old guys he knew in jail, and he used to read a lot of Westerns himself in jail. He was a bit of he was a guy that you would have enjoyed interviewing because he knew a lot of stuff.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Amazon Prime Video. One of the best on-demand streaming services available, Amazon Prime Video features exclusive Amazon originals as well as popular movies and TV shows. Watch Amazon Prime Video anytime, anywhere.
Right. He knew a lot of stuff. Yeah.
When it comes to crime and sport, when it comes to Australian film, so crime is covered in Australian film quite significantly, TV as well. A lot of the stuff that you've worked on with the Underbelly stuff, of course, that's been adapted to TV and stuff.
Yeah.
What's really frustrating to me when it comes to the Australian film industry is that although we are an incredibly proud sporting nation, and accomplished one at that, and we have such great sporting heroes, we don't have that many sports movies when you think about it. We just don't.
You're right.
I can't think, I can maybe think of 3 or 4, and even then, they're not sporting movies that have grabbed the attention of the public and made them big kind of things.
True.
And the best sporting movies that we can make is based on real life sporting people. So although, we had Kathy Freeman, I don't know why the life of me, her life story has not been made into a film. Why haven't films been made about rugby league players or Olympic heroes or what have you? It just hasn't happened. Why do you think it is that although we have films made about, we have crime movies, we have horror movies, genre films we're very great at, and also we're great kind of surreal, kind of satire, comedy kind of stuff, but the sports movie isn't there? Because as we talked about here with Story of Winx, the story of Winx and the people around her is fodder for a screen. In this case, a documentary. Why do you think we haven't seen more documentaries, and especially more feature films put out there, when history have shown there has been the Raging Bulls and the Fighter and Seabiscuit and everything else? Why do you think that is? Because I don't know for the life of me either.
I suspect, and you'd know better than I do, I suspect that our market is sufficiently small that we wouldn't get the budgets to make a great fictionalized sports film because of the necessity to recreate big scenes, and crowd scenes and all the rest of it. However, this documentary angle Kathy Freeman's a beauty. I did actually help I worked a little bit with some guys that did one on Lionel Rose. They did a mini series called Rose Against the Odds, and I put out the accompanying book. And so I had a slight association with that. I thought it wasn't a bad idea at the time. He was a flawed hero. I mean, one of the problems was that Lionel Rose became a jailbird, an alcoholic, a thug who hung around brothels. He really wasn't the most admirable person in retirement, and that probably made it a bit difficult for everybody involved, because he was, whereas Kathy Freeman is, a highly respected citizen. Lionel Rose, to be blunt, was not. We loved him because as a 19-year-old kid, he went to Japan and he beat the reigning champion at odds of 10-1 or something against him. And we loved that. And 250,000 Melburnians lined the streets of Melbourne when he flew in. He said, "Are the Beatles in town?" He couldn't believe it. Those sort of stories are few and far between. You'd wonder about John Landy, one of the great heroes. There's some other tales, but they're few and far between. And again, with boxing and racing, as we said, they're very hard to eclipse the real thing.
Yeah,
and mostly when you try and do it on the cheap, oh my God, it looks awful. I thought Farlap, the Farlap film was pretty ho-hum. You got film people don't know much about horses, and horses and jockeys and others don't know much about acting. It's oil and water, and so they're all out of their element. And when the film guy says, "I want this done," the people don't really quite understand what he wants, or say, "No, that's too hard," or "We can't do it," or whatever. And the poor old film people that are shelling out the money, they say, "Oh, you've gone and bought me these 6 horses for this scene. Oh, that's good." But the film people can't tell that these horses are not in racing condition. They've got, they're ungroomed, they're fat, they're thin. They're clearly not racehorses in racing condition. And that makes it look bad for the viewer, because most viewers will go, "Oh, that doesn't look right." Look like scrubbers. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things mitigating against trying to do those films. And I think that's true in boxing too. And I helped once make something with boxing scenes, and we were obliged to use actors. There was some obligation, legal obligation, to employ actors. And I wanted to use real guys out of a real boxing gym, and we were prevented from doing that. We had to use some actor that said he could hold his hands up. Well, he was awful. He boxed about as well as I did. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. Well, De Niro trained for how many months to do?
I think he did. Well, I know the diet that he did 6 months on a diet, and then they filmed, and then he did 6 months just traveling around Italy and fattening up for the later part.
For the later part,
just eating eating pasta and everything for the later part. But the training, I think he did the training for years. Because I think he and Scorsese were talking about that since like the movie came out in 80. I think they were talking about it since like 77 or 78. After Scorsese's cocaine rehab kind of era. But yeah, like a lot of actors like to try to put in the training. But it's funny, like you mentioned, I was talking to a director about a motorcycle racing movie. And he was talking about, he was just the amount of times he was talking to people in motorcycle racing had said they can't believe how even the sounds of bikes were incorrect. There will be like a Ducati on the screen, but the sound will be like some type of chopper bike or something like that. Even those kind of things that get wrong. People who know in the know just like get switched off straight away.
And that filters down, because people say, "Oh, well, what's it matter if that bit's wrong or that bit's wrong?" But it matters when 10,000 people see it and half of them see something wrong.
Yeah.
And they don't all see the same thing. You see different mistakes than I see, but we both see mistakes and we both badmouth the movie.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So it actually matters to get stuff right. And so many things don't. I mean, I can't, it's hard to, I'm sounding like a grumpy old guy because I am a grumpy old guy. But I just read recently a very fine, a novel set in World War One. and it's received rave reviews, and everybody thinks it's wonderful. It's written by this wonderful young woman who's a breakout, blah, blah, blah. But I got increasingly annoyed with it because there are no one who helped edit this, and there's probably 3 or 4 people in that process. No one realised that there were things in it that were just glaringly wrong. And one of them was, it's okay if that the wound I got in the trench yesterday, 1914, it's okay, I'll just have a tetanus shot and I'll be okay. Well, tetanus wasn't invented until the 1920s, 10 years later, and it wasn't used in warfare until World War II. So they were one war out with their facts. Now, several editors saw this. And the other thing is, these guys are supposed to be English gentlemen, they're English aristocrats who are in the trenches getting killed when they're 18 years old in 1914. So they've been born in the previous century. They're the products of the Victorian and Edwardian age. She's got them speaking dialogue as if they're sort of basically New York Jews, New Yorkers, as if they're Woody Allen's grandkids or something. Right. Well, it just in some respects. And it's jarring, and it's a lot of people in the business don't see those things as important, or they just don't know. There's a pervasive ignorance that
I think it comes. I think it comes down to displaying a level of authenticity in your storytelling. And I think what's so great about A Horse Named Winx is that the authenticity is there because we're going behind into the stables, we're going into the trenches, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we're talking to the people themselves. And it's this great combination of Janine's vision and skill, and then also your words and descriptions coming together, and then how everyone kind of like just blends it all together. So you have a movie that's engaging, but you have a documentary that lives up to the purposes of the genre itself. It's to engage you, but also to inform you. And the way that it informs you does so in a very authentic way. Yeah. And I think that's really important in movies today, because authenticity in movies today, there's a lot of escapism, but trying to find authenticity is very hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's what A Horse Named Winx definitely has. And for everyone out there listening, it's coming out this week, September 5 in cinemas. I really encourage everyone to go to the cinema and watch A Horse Named Winx, because number one, we need people in cinemas, and number two, we need more people watching Australian films. And this is a quintessentially Australian story made by Australian filmmakers. And I really encourage everyone to watch this film, because it is, like I said, you know how it ends, but you're going to be thrilled watching it as it runs up to that eventual conclusion. And I think it's just great work that Janine's done here. It's great work, Andrew, that you've done here. I think what you've done, it's really rare to find someone who's done the biography and then adapt that work into a different medium, especially a documentary.
Thank you. Yeah,
and I think you've done really great work here. So I just want to say congrats on the movie, and thank you for your time as well. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent, Matt. It's been a pleasure, and I'd love to talk to you some other time about get your advice on certain matters. I like your thoughts on what's at stake when you're trying to write for film, which I'm trying to do currently. Excellent. So you might be a good guy to talk to about whether something works or not.
Anytime.
You do watch a lot of films.
Yes, sir. Too many.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content.